Ruth Calloway would lose everything within 6 months, and Jasper Voss knew it the day he rode onto her land and looked at her water tank, the way a man looks at something he has already decided belongs to him. What neither of them knew yet was that a strange, cold patch of earth behind her barn, the kind of thing most folks would walk right past without a second glance, was about to bring the whole of his carefully built empire down around his ears. If you have ever watched a powerful man mistake kindness for weakness, stay with me, because this is the story of the day he learned better. Ruth had buried her husband Daniel 18 months earlier in the dry red dirt behind the house he had built with his own hands, and she had spent every one of those 18 months proving to a valley full of doubters that a widow could run 300 acres of grazing land alone. She had been a school teacher once, back in Missouri, before Daniel brought her west with promises of open sky and good soil, and though nothing in her education had prepared her for calving season or fence repair, she had learned both the hard way, through trial and the kind of stubbornness that made her neighbors alternately admire her and shake their heads. The Calloway Ranch sat at the low end of Copper Hollow, Colorado Territory, in a valley where every drop of water that mattered flowed down from Jasper Voss's land before it reached anyone else's. Voss owned 4,000 acres and the only working irrigation channel for 20 miles, and for 6 years he had let that water flow past Ruth's property line the same as it had for every small operation in the hollow, charging a fair rate for the privilege and calling it neighborliness. That changed the spring after Daniel died. "You understand my position, Mrs. Calloway," Voss said, standing at her fence line with his hat tipped back and his voice pitched in the reasonable, unhurried tone he used on everyone he intended to ruin. "A woman alone can't work 300 acres the way it needs working. The water I've been sending your way I could put to better use elsewhere, more productive use." "I've kept every payment current," Ruth said. "You know that better than anyone, since you're the one collecting them." "This isn't about payment," he smiled, and the smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "It's about sustainability. I'd hate to see good water wasted on land that can't be properly maintained." "The land is maintained fine." "For now." He looked past her, at the cattle grazing thin but healthy in the near pasture, at the mended fence line she had repaired herself 3 weeks earlier, cataloging it all the way a man catalogs something he plans to acquire cheap. "I'll make you an offer, Mrs. Calloway, a fair one. I'll buy the parcel outright, and you can move into town, find work more suited to your circumstances." "This is my husband's land." "Was," Voss said gently, and the gentleness was the cruelest part of it. "Was your husband's land. Things change." He rode off without waiting for her answer, and 3 days later, the water that had run steady through the channel behind her barn for 6 years slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Ruth stood at the dry channel bed that first morning with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, forcing herself not to shake. Panicking would not fill a water tank. She had learned that lesson early in widowhood, that the ranch did not care how frightened she was, only whether the chores got done. And so she did the chores, hauling water by the bucketful from the well near the house to keep the smaller stock alive while she tried to work out what came next. She rode to the water board office in town 2 days later, a cramped room above the mercantile where a tired, overworked clerk named Otis Fenwick kept records that had not been properly filed in a decade. "I need to see the original water rights for the Callaway parcel," she said. Fenwick sighed the sigh of a man who had already had this conversation with 3 other ranchers that month. "Mrs. Callaway, Mr. Voss owns the channel, owns the land it crosses. Legally, he's within his rights to control the flow as he sees fit, long as he's not violating the terms of the original grant." "And what are the terms of the original grant?" "That's the trouble." Fenwick gestured at a wall of disorganized shelving, ledgers stacked without order, decades of territorial records gathering dust in the poor light. "Half these records burned in the courthouse fire of '61. What's left isn't cataloged proper. Could take a man months to find anything specific, if it's even still here." "Then I'll need months," Ruth said. "Mrs. Callaway, I'd love to help you, truly I would. But I've got a stack of business from 3 other townships and no help filing it. I can't spare the hours." She left the office with nothing but a promise from Fenwick to look when he found time, which she understood, even as she left, to mean he would not look at all. The following weeks tested her in ways the ranch never had before. She rationed water with the precision of a woman balancing a ledger that could not go into debt, hauling buckets from the well before dawn and after dusk, watching her herd thin as the smaller water supply strained to cover both the animals and the garden that had, until now, kept her fed through winter. Word traveled through Copper Hollow the way it always did, distorted a little more with every telling, until half the valley believed Ruth Callaway was failing because a woman alone simply could not manage what her husband had left behind, and the other half whispered that she must have done something to earn Jasper Voss's displeasure, because a man as reasonable as Voss did not turn hard without cause. The Hendersons, who ran the spread 2 miles east and had known Daniel since before Ruth arrived in the territory, stopped inviting her to Sunday supper. The mercantile owner's wife, a woman named Prudence, who had once brought Ruth a pie the week of Daniel's funeral, now found reasons to serve other customers first whenever Ruth came through the door. Ruth told herself it did not matter, that she had weathered worse since Daniel's death, and mostly she believed it, except in the quiet hour before sleep, when the isolation pressed close enough to feel like something physical. It was her hired hand, an elderly widower named Amos Peartree, who had worked the Callaway land since before Daniel bought it and had refused every offer to retire, who first noticed the cold patch of ground behind the barn. "Ground's wrong there," Amos said one morning in early June, standing over a stretch of earth no more than 10 feet across, tucked into the shade behind the old barn where the grass grew a little too green for how dry the season had been. "Cooler than it ought to be. Been noticing it a week now. Ground don't stay damp like that on its own, not with the water shut off the way it's been." Ruth crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the soil, and Amos was right. It was cool and faintly damp in a season when everything else on the property had turned to dust. "Could be nothing," she said, though something in her chest had already begun to hope in a way she did not want to name yet, for fear of how it would feel if the hope proved foolish. "Could be," Amos agreed. "Or could be worth digging." They dug for 3 days, working in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, and on the 3rd day, 18 inches down, the shovel struck something that was not soil. Ruth knelt and cleared the loose earth away with her hands, and beneath it found stone, old and weathered, arranged in a way that looked deliberate rather than accidental, and beneath the stone, water. Cold, clear, moving water, coming up from somewhere far below the reach of Jasper Voss's controlled channel. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and laughed, once, a startled sound that surprised her as much as it surprised Amos. "Well," Amos said, looking down at the small, steady spring now exposed to daylight for what might have been the first time in decades. "That changes things some." It changed things considerably, though Ruth understood enough about the territory's water law to know that finding a spring on her own land did not automatically mean she was entitled to use it. Not with a man like Jasper Voss watching for any excuse to tighten his grip on the hollow. She needed someone who understood hydrology, someone whose word would carry weight if this came to a fight. And so she wrote to a name Daniel had once mentioned in passing, a retired engineer named Cornelius Whitfield, who had spent 30 years surveying water systems across 3 territories before settling into a quiet retirement 2 counties over. Whitfield arrived a week later, a spare, precise man in his 60s with ink-stained fingers and a magnifying loupe he carried everywhere. And he spent 2 full days examining the spring, testing its flow rate, tracing what he could of its underground course, using methods Ruth did not fully understand, but watched with fascination. "This isn't fed by Voss's channel," Whitfield said finally, standing at the edge of the newly exposed spring with his notebook full of careful measurements. "This is an independent aquifer source, likely been here since long before anyone settled this valley. My guess, and I'd stake real money on it, this spring predates every water claim currently on file in Copper Hollow." "What does that mean for me?" "It means, if the historical record supports it, this water is yours outright, no matter what Voss controls upstream. But it also means he's going to fight you on it. Because a spring like this, properly developed, could supply half this valley without depending on his channel at all. That's not just water he'd be losing, Mrs. Calloway. That's control." Ruth understood exactly what Whitfield meant, and word of the discovery reached Jasper Voss faster than she expected, likely through one of the men she had hired temporarily to help with the digging. He rode onto her property 3 days later without the reasonable smile he usually wore, his jaw set hard, his voice carrying none of its previous gentleness. "You've been digging where you've no business digging," he said. "On my own land," Ruth said. "I don't need your permission for that." "That spring, if it's what you think it is, sits close enough to the property line that ownership's going to be disputed. I'd think twice before you go telling the whole valley you've found something that isn't settled law yet." "It's settled the moment someone with authority looks at the records and confirms it, Mr. Voss, which I intend to make happen." Something shifted in his face then, brief but unmistakable. The calculation of a man recalculating an angle he had not expected to need. "You're making a mistake," he said. "This valley runs on cooperation. Men who don't cooperate find themselves without friends when they need them most." "I've been without friends in this valley for 6 weeks now," Ruth said. "I've managed." He left without another word, but the pressure that followed was immediate and specific. The bank in town, where Voss held considerable influence through investments Ruth had no way of tracing, suddenly found reason to call in a note on farm equipment Daniel had financed years before its term was due. A rumor began circulating that Ruth had been seen digging on Voss land itself, trespassing, stealing water that belonged to him, a claim with no truth in it that nonetheless traveled through Copper Hollow faster than Whitfield's careful science ever could. Ruth absorbed each blow with the same restraint she had shown since Daniel's funeral, paying what she could on the called note, continuing her chores with the same unbroken routine, refusing to give the valley the satisfaction of watching her crumble in public, even as the strain settled deep into her shoulders and the sleepless hours before dawn. Amos watched her work through it with quiet, steady loyalty, saying little, doing more than his years should have allowed, and it was Amos who finally suggested she needed a lawyer rather than simply an engineer. The attorney Ruth hired, a methodical, unhurried man named Nathaniel Corbett, who had built a modest but respected practice 2 towns over, spent the better part of a month digging through the same disorganized records Otis Fenwick had once claimed would take months to search, and found, buried in a box of pre-territorial survey documents that had somehow survived the courthouse fire because they had been improperly stored in a private collection rather than the courthouse itself, an 1849 land survey predating the formal territorial water grants entirely. This spring is named specifically, Corbett said, laying the fragile, yellowed document across Ruth's kitchen table with the careful reverence of a man handling something irreplaceable. Referred to here as the Hollow Spring, marked on the original survey boundary that later became your husband's parcel. Under territorial law, a documented natural water source predating the formal grants supersedes any downstream channel rights established afterward. If this document holds up before the Water Board, Mrs. Calloway, that spring is yours, clear and unencumbered, and no amount of money Voss throws at this changes that. Will it hold up? It should, but I won't pretend Voss doesn't have influence over how quickly this moves, or that he won't try to discredit the document's authenticity. Corbett's expression turned grave. Men like him don't lose control of something this valuable without a fight. The fight came faster than expected, and from a direction Ruth had not anticipated. Jasper Voss's foreman, a quiet, capable man named Silas Reed, who had worked the Voss Channel gates for 9 years and had personally closed the flow to Ruth's property on Voss's direct order, appeared at her door late one evening, hat in his hands, looking like a man who had spent days working up the nerve to knock. "I need to say something, Mrs. Calloway, and I need you to hear me out before you decide what to think of me for it." "Go on." "I closed your water gate myself, followed orders, same as I always have, told myself it wasn't my business to question why." He turned his hat over once, twice, the same nervous motion Amos made when troubled. "But I've been keeping records of my own for years, private ones, gate logs, flow measurements, orders given and when. Voss don't know I kept copies, and in those records there's proof he shut off your water specifically because he learned Daniel had been in talks, before he passed, about formalizing a water rights claim on this parcel that would have protected you from exactly what's happened these past weeks. Voss knew about the spring's potential before you ever found it, Mrs. Calloway. He's known for years. He was counting on you never digging deep enough to find it yourself." Ruth felt something cold move through her, understanding settling into place. Why come forward now? Because I've got a daughter of my own, grown now, out in Kansas, and I got to thinking what I'd want a man to do if it was her standing where you're standing. He held out a worn leather logbook, offering it across the threshold. This is everything, every order, every date. I know it costs me my position, handing this over. Voss will know it was me the second this comes out. But I'd rather lose the position than keep living with what I've been part of. Ruth took the logbook with hands that were not quite steady. Thank you, Mr. Reed. I know what this costs you. Do right by it, he said. That's all I ask. The public hearing convened 3 weeks later in the Territorial Water Board's cramped, fluorescent-lit meeting hall in town, packed tighter than Ruth had ever seen it. Half the valley crowded in to watch the outcome of a dispute that had become, over the preceding weeks, the primary subject of conversation in every home in Copper Hollow. Jasper Voss sat at the front with his own attorney, composed and confident in a way that suggested he had not yet grasped how thoroughly the ground beneath him had shifted. Corbett presented the 1849 survey first, methodical and unhurried, walking the board through the document's provenance and authentication with the patience of a man who understood that thoroughness, not theatrics, won cases like this one. Whitfield followed, laying out his hydrological findings in careful technical detail that left little room for dispute. And when Voss's attorney attempted to argue the spring's connection to the disputed property line remained unclear, Corbett produced Silas Reed's logbook, and Reed himself, present in the room at Ruth's invitation, stood and confirmed under oath that Voss had known of the spring's likely existence for years, and had deliberately withheld water from the Callaway parcel specifically to prevent Ruth from ever discovering it. The room went very quiet. "Is this true, Mr. Voss?" the board chairman asked. Voss's composure finally cracked, the reasonable mask slipping to reveal something harder and more desperate underneath. "I protected the interests of this entire valley for 6 years. One widow's parcel doesn't outweigh the water system that serves 20 families. "That may be," the chairman said, "but the law doesn't weigh interests, Mr. Voss. It weighs documented rights, and this document predates every claim you hold." The board's ruling came within the hour. The hollow spring belonged, unencumbered, to the Callaway parcel, and Voss was ordered to restore full channel flow to Ruth's property immediately, along with a formal reprimand entered into the territorial record for the deliberate withholding of documented water rights. It did not destroy Jasper Voss, not entirely. He remained the largest landholder in the valley, remained a man of considerable influence. But something in Copper Hollow shifted permanently that afternoon. An understanding among the smaller ranchers that his reasonableness had never been kindness, only patience waiting for opportunity. And men who had once deferred to him without question began in small ways to question him instead. "You did not have to hand that logbook over," Ruth told Silas Reed outside the meeting hall afterward as the crowd dispersed around them into the warm evening air. You could have kept quiet and kept your position. Could have, Reed agreed. Wouldn't have been able to look at myself in a mirror after, though. Some costs aren't worth avoiding, Mrs. Calloway. She offered him work on her own land that same week, managing the New Springs development alongside Amos, and Reed accepted without hesitation. A man rebuilding his own standing the same slow, deliberate way Ruth had rebuilt hers. By late autumn, the Calloway Ranch had transformed in ways Ruth could not have imagined the morning she first knelt over that strange, cold patch of earth behind the barn. The spring, properly developed under Whitfield's continued guidance, supplied not only her own herd, but, through an agreement she negotiated herself rather than one imposed upon her, 2 neighboring smaller operations that had struggled under Voss's channel for years, the same way she once had. The Hendersons resumed their Sunday invitations, sheepish about the months of silence, and Prudence at the Mercantile began saving the good cuts of fabric for Ruth the way she once had. An unspoken apology neither woman felt the need to voice directly. Ruth stood at the edge of the spring one evening in late October, watching the water catch the last orange light of the day. Amos beside her, checking the new stone channel they had built together to guide the flow toward the pasture. "Daniel would have liked this," Amos said quietly. "Liked seeing what you made of it." "He'd have liked knowing it was here the whole time," Ruth said. "Under our own feet. We just never had reason to look close enough to find it." "Some things are like that," Amos said. "Sitting right where you are, waiting on someone stubborn enough to dig." Ruth smiled and looked out over land that was, finally and entirely, undisputed as her own. The water moving steady and cold beneath a sky going purple with evening, and thought that Corbett had been right about one thing above all else. The law did not weigh interests. It weighed what a person had the patience to prove. She had proven hers, inch by inch, bucket by bucket, through a season that had tried to convince her she could not hold what belonged to her. And she had held it anyway. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refused to back down. And thank you for staying with me through this one.